Thanks for joining us for CBN NewsWatch. I'm Heather Sells.
And I'm Mark Martin. Islamic State militants suffered two major setbacks on the battlefield this week, one in Iraq and another in Syria. But in the midst of defeat, they've turned to more outlandish acts, this time kidnapping scores of Christians in Syria. Gary Lane has more.
The Iraqi military hailed its important victory this week against the Islamic State. ISIS forces were routed from al-Baghdadi, a city west of Baghdad that they've held since last June. But al-Baghdadi was not the only town of defeat for the ISIS forces. Peshmerga troops in northeastern Syria, known as the YPG, drove Islamic State militants from the Kurdish city of Tal Tamr. But as they retreated, the ISIS jihadists kidnapped at least 90 Assyrian Christians. The men were taken to an undisclosed location, the women to a nearby mountain. Based on their past actions, ISIS may behead the abducted men and use the women as sex slaves. Juliana Tamarazzi is with the Assyrian Philos Project.
These women were sobbing, saying, what is our fault? Why is the West silent? Why is the church not talking about our persecution? And they're questioning the foreign policy of America and also other world powers in Europe, saying, why is it that there's no agenda, there's really nothing that is being done to help the persecuted in the Middle East?
U.S. wake up!
U.S. wake up! ISIS is the Lord!
A group of Egyptian-American Coptics gathered near the White House Tuesday, demanding that the Obama administration do more to protect Egyptian, Syrian, and Iraqi Christians.
The Obama administration didn't make a clear statement that these individuals were killed for their faith. They actually referred to them in their White House statement as Egyptian citizens, and that's very disappointing to the Coptic community.
Brotherhood, ISIS, Boko Haram, I want to take action against them instead of support them.
And Egyptian President al-Sisi is calling for a united Arab military force to combat ISIS. He says Jordan and the United Arab Emirates have already offered to help Egypt on the battlefield. Gary Lane, CBN News.
The search for an American missionary in Nigeria is underway. Phyllis Sorter was abducted from her Christian school's compound in the central part of the country. The Free Methodist Church says the State Department and FBI are working with Nigerian authorities to find her. Family and friends say Sorter understood the risks of working in a country known for Islamic terrorism, but question why she was kidnapped.
Oh, she's grown up with dangers. She knows full well what she's involved with.
Here's a country 5,000 miles. You got to drive a plane a day and a half to get to. And they're over there doing good for other people, and this happens.
Friends and family describe Sorter as a visionary involved in multiple projects to help the Nigerian people.
He calls himself a soldier of Christ, and he's back in Iraq battling ISIS on the front lines. Brett is a 28-year-old U.S. Army Iraq war veteran. He returned to Iraq 6 months ago to join a Christian militia fighting ISIS. For the safety of his family, he's requesting that his last name remain unknown. He's involved in a battle near Mosul.
I may not know them before, but they're my people. The Assyrian Christians of this world, they're indigenous to this part of the world. People are hellbent on erasing them in the history. People ask me, why you? I come back and I say, why not? Why just me? Where's everyone else at?
Brett says he has a price on his head, but says it's in God's hands and God's will, and God has equipped him with many tools to fight ISIS.
To find the Republican-run Congress, President Obama has vetoed the Keystone XL oil pipeline bill. The move sends the bill back to Congress, where some Senate Democrats are already saying that they will vote to override the president. Caitlin Burke reports.
The Keystone pipeline bill is President Obama's first veto since Republicans took control on Capitol Hill.
By choosing to veto this piece of legislation, he is choosing Washington lobbyists and special interests over the needs and desires of the American people.
In a brief notice delivered to the Senate, Obama said, quote, "The presidential power to veto legislation is one I take seriously, but I also take seriously my responsibility to the American people." The nearly 1,200-mile-long pipeline would run from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico and has been stalled for more than 6 years. Supporters say it would boost U.S. energy independence, along with the economy.
This isn't a pipeline, it's a lifeline for America's construction workers.
Opponents call the pipeline the poster child for dirty energy and say it would exacerbate global warming. House Speaker John Boehner said Obama's veto is a national embarrassment, and Republicans promise to fight to override it. Some Senate Democrats say they'll vote for an override too, a clear rebuke of Obama. But an override will fail unless Republicans and Democrats who support the pipeline can recruit 4 more senators to their cause. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
North Korea could have as many as 100 nuclear bombs by the year 2020. That's the conclusion of the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University. In a new report, the Institute says North Korea has made significant progress in its weapons program. The communist nation currently has about 10 bombs in its stockpile. The Institute says that number could grow to between 20 and 100 over the next 5 years. North Korea still is not able to put nuclear warheads on rockets capable of hitting the U.S.
Iran's Navy is practicing military drills. State TV footage shows missiles fired near a strategic Gulf waterway, striking a mock U.S. carrier craft. Iran's Guard's chief commander said the drills, quote, send a message of Iran's might to extraterritorial powers, which was a reference to the United States. U.S. naval officials say the U.S. is monitoring the drills and is not concerned about them. Meanwhile, a former U.S. ambassador is warning about the current nuclear negotiations between Iran and 6 world powers. John Bolton says Iran can't be trusted.
We've conceded they have a right to a peaceful nuclear program, despite the fact that for close to 30 years now, they've already violated their solemn obligation under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty not to seek nuclear weapons. So since they've already violated the word they gave decades ago, what possible reason is there to think they'll keep their word now?
The 6 world powers have set March 24th as their latest deadline to reach an agreement. The negotiations are being watched closely by Israel, that considers Iran's nuclear program an existential threat.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he'll allow a clean vote on funding the Department of Homeland Security. That means without a provision blocking funding unless President Obama's executive order on immigration is overturned.
But would America be less safe if Homeland Security didn't get all of its money? Or would anybody even notice? It's the latest and so far the biggest political battle between President Obama and the new Republican majority in Congress. Jennifer Wishon brings us the story from Washington.
In an effort to put faces in front of the funding battle, Department of Homeland Security personnel were placed behind Secretary Jay Johnson as he listed his department's duties.
Counterterrorism, border security, aviation security, port security, maritime security, cyber security, protection of critical infrastructure in this country. None of this is free.
The Republican-controlled Senate is ready to pass the funding bill, but Senate Democrats are blocking it. They don't like a provision in the bill tacked on by House Republicans that unravels President Obama's unilateral executive action on immigration, the move that defers the deportation of some 5 million immigrants living inside the U.S. illegally. The debate is not whether or not the Department of Homeland Security should be funded. Rather, it's whether or not Congress should use its power of the nation's pocketbook to stop President Obama from doing something many Americans believe is unconstitutional.
The executive action the president took late last year was clearly an unconstitutional end run around the lawmaking authority of the Congress of the United States.
Pence is one of the state leaders from across the country in Washington for the annual Governors Conference at the White House. President Obama appealed to governors to put pressure on the representatives in Congress to pass the bill.
They all work in your states. These are folks who, if they don't have a paycheck, are not going to be able to spend that money in your states. It will have a direct impact on your economy, and it will have a direct impact on America's national security.
But the Obama administration is also trying to protect the president's immigration action on another front, after a federal judge in Texas last week put a temporary hold on the move, in a case where 26 states are trying to stop the president's plan to protect illegal immigrants from going into effect. The administration has filed an appeal because the White House would like the immigration order to go into effect while the case is still in the courts. Some wonder if the White House is really making a strong enough case that it's truly urgent to pass the bill to fund Homeland Security. Monday in his daily briefing, Press Secretary Josh Earnest had a hard time explaining exactly how national security will be harmed if a funding bill isn't passed. If an agreement isn't reached, most DHS employees will still be required to report to work, but they won't receive a paycheck until Congress appropriates the money. 30,000 employees would be asked to stay home. And then there's the politics of the situation. Some conservatives argue the president's move to protect illegal immigrants is unpopular with the public. But despite that, Republicans worry they will take the fall, even though Democrats are actually the ones blocking the bill from coming to a vote.
If we don't fund the Department of Homeland Security, we'll get blamed as a party.
Some Republicans outside of Washington say the fight to stop the president is worth it. They say he abused his power and violated the Constitution, even after he said more than 20 times that he couldn't unilaterally move to help illegal immigrants. He did so anyway.
We need to protect the homeland. We also need to protect the Constitution.
Funding for DHS runs out Friday. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, the White House.
The new Secretary of Defense has indicated that he is open to allowing transgender people in the military. Responding to a reporter's question, Secretary Ashton Carter said the only standard should be suitability for service. The White House says it supports Carter's statement. Meanwhile, the State Department has named its first ever special envoy to promote the rights of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgenders around the world. The Hill report, Secretary of State John Kerry said the U.S. is working internationally to roll back laws against consensual same-sex activity.
Coming up, young tennis players from South Africa see Israel firsthand and see it's not apartheid after all.
A U.S. court has found the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization guilty of killing Americans. A jury in Manhattan ruled both groups carried out terrorist attacks around Jerusalem in the early 2000s that killed 33 people and wounded 450 others, including several Americans. The prosecution proved that many of the terrorists were employed by the Palestinian Authority. The jury awarded the U.S. victims $218 million in damages, but the amount will actually be tripled under the U.S. Anti-terrorism Act. The PA and the PLO plan to appeal the verdict.
World leaders and media often accuse Israel of being an apartheid state because of its policies toward Palestinians. But the Jewish state hopes to change that image.
And it's doing it with the help of some South Africans who lived through racial segregation for almost 50 years. Julie Stahl has that story.
When South African tennis coach Moses Ntuping brought 4 of his young tennis players to Israel, it was something he had waited for all his life.
This is a dream come true for me.
As a teenager, Ntuping developed into a star tennis player, but could never travel or play on national teams.
Unfortunately, during those apartheid years, we have not been given opportunity to experience what I'm experiencing now at this age, at my age.
Ronen Morali of the Israel Tennis Center invited the group to visit. He said the idea came from the Israeli ambassador who wanted to introduce the South Africans to the real Israel.
Sport, it's like a bridge over, over cultures, over, to bring, people together and to see that Israelis are normal people, without horns in their head, and I think it did the job.
Ntuping said he saw nothing that resembled the racial segregation of apartheid.
So far, I haven't seen anything that I can criticize about Israel. All I could see is people, jolly people, friendly people, all the way, willing to help wherever possible.
And it touched the youngsters as well.
I know about Israel fighting, there's a war, but I thought where I'm going there will be a peace place and no war there.
They're so kind to us. I see they're treating us like families. I think it's an incredible country that has incredible people, kind people that must appreciate people from Africa or Northern America or South America, the whole world.
The Israel Tennis Center started nearly 40 years ago. Now they have 14 centers around the country like this one in Jerusalem, serving 20,000 children a week from different backgrounds.
The Israel Tennis Center is a blend of everything, like you have Arab kids, you have Ethiopian kids, you have everything, a blend of everything. You have Christians, you have Arab Christians, it's like a blend of everything. This is what, why this project is so beautiful.
Like Mohammed, who is Muslim, and his Jewish friend, Omer. Both want to eventually turn professional and say their friendship is the best part of the tennis center. That positive atmosphere helps when new players visit.
The first time I play with the kids from South Africa, and I like to play with them. I didn't realize that I will play with them. It's just so unreal, I think.
This first exchange proved successful, and those at the Israel Tennis Center hope for many more opportunities in the future. Julie Stahl, CBN News, the Israel Tennis Center, Jerusalem.
Up next, the true story about a hero from the Underground Railroad. Hear why one best-selling author had to rewrite her own life story.
The question is, did he own slaves or did he help set them free?
Some people believe John Hunn was a slave owner, including a best-selling author, Dr. Bertrice Berry. But then she found out the truth. Charlene Aaron brings us that story.
By most accounts, Dr. Bertrice Berry has led a successful life. Born in poverty, she earned a PhD, became a nationally syndicated talk show host, and best-selling author. Along the way, though, she made what she calls one of her greatest errors.
It would bring it up. Yeah. It would bring it up.
In her novel, Redemption Song, she names her villain an evil slaveholder after a real man, John Hunn.
Old man Hunn wasn't so old then. He was out hunting my mama and me. He wasn't a real catcher. Others caught slaves for money. He caught them for keeps. John Hunn, I knew the story. I heard the name that he owned the plantation that our family lived on during slavery.
Despite her mother's repeated objections, Dr. Berry believed Hunn owned her ancestors.
Especially in the 60s and 70s, back when we were slaves, that was my slave name. And my mother would say, we were not slaves. I'm like, oh, you're having a slave fantasy. Delaware was a slave state.
But one day she came upon the PBS documentary, Whispers of Angels, about the Underground Railroad.
Burris eventually guided them to the home of the young Quaker John Hunn in Middletown.
Eventually, he became known as the chief engineer of the Underground Railroad in Delaware. So he was very well known, and people would that were helping the slaves escape would say, go see John Hunn.
John Hunn helped as many as 200 fugitive slaves make their way to freedom.
John Hunn's father and uncle were the owners of this property. They inherited it in 1794.
Historian Robin Krawitz has studied John Hunn for the past 20 years. She learned that his father, Ezekiel Hunn, also helped runaway slaves escape.
He had funded an African-American boatman to ferry people from here and from the St. Johns River over to New Jersey, which was the closest point of freedom.
His son, however, had other plans as a young man. After training to be a silk merchant, he visited his older sister, Patience, a devout Quaker. She took one look at his fancy clothes and said, "Throw off thy Babylonish garment."
And she basically read him the Riot Act and said, come back to the faith, be who you are. And it took.
John Hunn was 27 years old when he became involved with the Underground Railroad. It was a cold, snow-covered day like this. He was washing his hands at a pump outside his home when he saw an unfamiliar covered wagon approach.
There was a group of people who were escaping enslavement from Queen Anne's County in Maryland, traveling all night in a wagon and on foot. He brought in the women and children into the house, and then the men went out into the barn, and they were all housed and warmed up and fed, and then to get them ready to continue on their journey. John Hunn's house here.
But a neighbor turned them in to the local magistrate. While they eventually made their way to freedom, John Hunn was prosecuted in federal court. Under the fugitive slave law, it was a federal crime to assist runaway slaves, and slave owners could sue anyone who did so. In this courthouse, John Hunn was brought before Judge Robert Tawney. Tawney would later write the infamous Dred Scott decision, ruling that African Americans did not have civil rights protected by the U.S. Constitution.
Well, he didn't contest the charges. He said, yeah, I did it. So he was heavily fined.
Hun's world fell apart. He lost everything. His family had to move in with relatives, and his 6-year-old son died after a long illness. Still, Hun steadfastly continued his work.
I think his calling was so strong, and he felt this issue was such an important issue that he didn't feel he could stop.
On his deathbed, Hun ordered his son to burn all records of his activity in the Underground Railroad. He wrote, "I ask no other reward for any efforts made by me in the cause than to feel that I have been of use to my fellow men. No other course would have brought me peace of mind."
It was a shock. I've used this man's name, who is the southernmost conductor of the Underground Railroad, who remained hidden the same way we do with everything. We think everything is black and white, good and evil, sin and righteous. You know, no. You know, there's so much more to every story if you just look a little further.
And that she did. Determined to set the record straight, Barry wrote The Ties That Bind, a memoir of race, memory, and redemption.
If you had the opportunity to speak to him face to face, what would you say?
To John Hun? Oh, wow, dude, you are so cool. Thank you. And while the laws are against you now, years from now, everyone will know that you're right.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Finally today, CBN is reaching kids in Indonesia thanks to young Superbook fans.
17 young girls who want to reach and help disciple other kids in their walk with Jesus recently donated their time to help pack hundreds of Superbook DVDs. As a result, 1,000 DVDs were distributed all over Indonesia. The girls said they were happy that CBN was sending Superbook throughout their country so many more kids can watch it. Superbook has also aired on the largest TV station in Indonesia, and what a great country to reach.
I'll tell you what, Superbook all over the world reaching so many people. That's it for now on CBN NewsWatch. Thanks for your time today.
You can find more of our exclusive coverage on the issues you care most about at cbnnews.com. Have a great day.